Matthias Sackholm is a guy we actually don't plan on talking about today, but that's okay because we've got a big show. Welcome everybody to another episode of the Keeping Karlsson Fantasy Hockey Podcast, the best fantasy hockey podcast in the world, hosted by two guys who at one point owned Erik Karlsson in their keeper pools. I'm excited. It's been a month since I've done this, Brian. Here we go. I'm your host, Elon Dubrowski. With me, Brian Com.
What a relief to hear your voice back on the Keeping Karlsson Fantasy Hockey Podcast. Way too much of mine, and yours is better anyway.
Thanks to Mark for the help with the intro here in the chat room. We are live, by the way, on Google Hangouts, keepingkarlsson.com/live. For those of you listening thinking, how can I get live next time? That's all. You just go there. It always leads you to the right place. But yeah, Mark, great job with the yes name. Tweet at us at Keeping Karlsson if you have ideas for yes names.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, what am I doing? We got so much to talk about. Okay, here's the plan for today. The last few episodes, we've been just kind of talking about what we've been seeing in the playoffs, talking about some players that were interesting us. But now we're going to get into super summer series content. Like, this is the serious nerdy stuff. We're going to start looking back on the season that has passed and see what we can learn from it. Today, the plan is to go over some players who disappointed, who were drafted higher than what they ended up producing. And Brian took a deep dive into these players and is going to let us know if he thinks that they are going to continue to be bad or if it was an anomaly and all these guys are going to bounce back and they're going to be very nice value picks in your drafts. I guess before we get into that, Brian, let's mention that we are presented by the best fantasy hockey website out there, DobberHockey.com, who just released a prospects guide. So with the draft coming up, now is the time to go and do your research. Check out what they think about all the prospects. You've got rankings from a bunch of different Dobber contributors. Lots of really good stuff there. And if you are in a keeper league or even a one-year league and you want to get a late pick of a guy who no one else has heard of, and that is going to totally steal the show for you, like a hashtag Team Werenski 2017-18 version, check it out, DobberHockey.com, and check out that prospects guide.
Yeah, you and I have both purchased the guide, and we will definitely hope to bear the fruits of Dobber and crew's labor as we try and find the next big thing while they're still not so big.
Brian, why did you purchase it? You should have told me. We could have shared it. Look at us. We're just first of all, we're giving a discount to our patrons over the summer. It's only $1 to be a patron, so we already got rid of all that money. Now we're throwing money buying two kinds of guides.
I was just being polite. I'm using your copy.
That's what I thought. Okay. Let's get started with the first player I want to talk about. This is the guy on my list of disappointing players. And by the way, those of you in the chat room, at the end of the show, we'll do a quick lightning round. You can throw up some of your players you want to talk about. But I think I came up with a pretty good list. Here's the guy who I think was drafted the highest last year of all the guys I was going to talk about. This is a perennial first. Maybe lately he's been a high second round pick in our patron rankings. That this is the second year we've done it. Thanks to patron Dave for setting all of that up. Last season, going into the season, this guy was ranked at 16. This year, in our rankings, he's all the way down at 41. I'm talking about Claude Giroux. This was a guy who you could depend on for like a solid bet for a 70-point floor with upside for more. He's been a point-per-game guy for so many seasons. And this year, huge disappointment. He ended up with only 58 points, 14 goals, 44 assists in 82 games. You can't blame it on injuries. Less than 60 points. For a guy that you would have thought 70 points, it's not like a total disaster of a year. We've got some players coming up that maybe were even worse, makes the Giroux pick not even seem that bad. It's not like you ended up dropping him to free agency. But still, this is a guy who had 67 points in 2015-16. He had 73 the year before, 86 the year before, 48 in 48 games the year before that, 93 before that. Like, he's consistently been, like I said, a 70-plus point guy with so much upside for more. He's only 29 years old. So it makes me wonder, Brian, I know that sometimes you like to talk about these aging curves. I said only 29 years old, but maybe that's kind of old for hockey. Like, are we just seeing a progression that we would expect at this age? Like, if I say those numbers backwards, he's 86, 73, 67, and 58 points in the last 4 years. So he's been steadily declining. Do we expect him to keep on declining or to stay at around this 58 point, like 60 point pace? Or do you think he could get back up to that 70 point pace next year?
The best we can hope for Claude Giroux is that he Benjamin Buttons himself and just goes back up that list that you went in the reverse direction. But of course, we're going to go a little bit beyond hoping that happens and dig into his numbers to see, well, where did this drop happen? There were several, as you detailed, Elon, such a huge disappointment. Several weeks-long stretches last season where he was a half point per game guy which just isn't okay. If you drafted him in the early rounds last year or prioritized him as like a top can't touch keeper, he's been a perennial first or second round pick, and he's likely to fall beneath that after last year's terribly underwhelming campaign that you detailed very well. I'm just going to add a few little tidbits here. He had the lowest points per 60 rate of his career. He actually had a half point per 60 lower than his previous low, and that came way back in his sophomore season, back in 2008, 2009. So what exactly happened? Well, I think there are a lot of contextual possibilities factoring in here, and that's going to be a theme for this whole show, Elon. You know, we like to look at a player's numbers and see, well, they're not doing this and they're not doing this. All it does is describe things in a vacuum without really understanding why exactly it's happening. So we're going to do our best to look at those numbers, find the weird ones, and figure out what's happening around them.
Yeah, well, for sure. That's the plan. Like, your typical fantasy hockey opponent that you're going to face is going to be drafting based mostly on last year's numbers and maybe a little bit of an upgrade for players that have a big name like your Henrik Zetterbergs or your Claude Giroux.
How did you go to Henrik Zetterberg before Claude Giroux?
I don't know. Henrik Zetterberg's really good.
But we're on Claude Giroux.
All right, so tell us about all these contextual things that led to Claude Giroux having such a bad season.
Okay, well, first we're gonna blind ourselves from those and look straight at the numbers, and then try and figure out possible explanations based on the context. So looking at his straight up numbers, his shots on goal and shot attempt per 60-minute rates both fell to career lows at even strength, and it wasn't a gentle drop for him from last season either. Giroux was attempting 3 fewer shots per 60 minutes compared to his 2015-16 season, and that is kind of a big deal. Those are numbers that should be roughly under his control as well and not swinging one way or the other just based on variance. But there are a couple numbers more prone to variance that were also working against him. So first, and by the way, when I say variance, I guess what I'm trying to intimate here is luck, or what most of us would call luck. But luck is just unexplained variance if we don't want to believe that, you know, I mean, sure, you make your own luck, that could be part of it. But a lot of people classify, especially in stats today, luck as whatever they haven't figured out how to measure yet. So I'm using the word variance, which is just a little more appropriate and gives it a little more credibility rather than just saying, well, he's snake bitten. So anyway, couple numbers prone to variance that were working against Claude Giroux. First, his even strength IPP was down at 53%, which is 15 to 20% lower than it's ever been before. It's normally been in and around the 70% range, which is right for an elite scorer. And this, I believe, is something variance related and that he can recover from. Like, it's just a one-off. I'm not sure exactly why that happened, but I think it'll come back, as IPP tends to do. It usually have a pretty steady, not necessarily static, but a number that stays within a given range, or at least if it's going to decline, it's going to decline more slowly than what happened last year. Then you look at his individual and on-ice shooting percentages at even strength. They were also down to career lows this past year. Normally, I'd say these are also variance-related stats, but I'm not so sure. His shot locations, as well as frequent line mate Jacob Voracek's shot locations, they've been getting curiously pushed further and further back over the last few seasons. And this, I chalk up more to a coaching and systems issue than a personal failure of Giroux or Voracek. My concern, of course, is that Dave Haxtell is still at the helm at this point in the offseason. I called for a new Flyers coach. I don't know why they didn't listen, and he still has the job. So anyway, I worry that there might not be an effective fix on the horizon for whatever coaching or systems issues that are causing these elite superstars in Giroux or Voracek to just have to take shots further and further from the net.
All right, so can I just do a quick summary before you continue here? Because you've packed so much into those sentences. So first, what you're saying his IPP was down, which you're saying is kind of like, well, that could happen. Just happens to be that goals were scored while he was on the ice, and for whatever reason, he wasn't getting in on them. Maybe he was getting the first pass that led to the second pass that led to the guy who scored, and so he didn't get the point even though he was part of the play. Sometimes that happens. So okay, I like that. And then you're saying for the shooting percentages, you're saying that he had a lower shooting percentage, and generally we like to think that that's more luck related, but you're saying that because the shots were worse, like the shot quality was down, that could explain it, and that's something that might maybe continue if the system continues to be bad and if they continue to be coached in this poor way as you think they have been. I also, side note, do you just not like Hackstall because...
Yes.
Steve Mason wasn't playing enough, and now you're just assuming that anything bad that happens with Philadelphia is related to coaching?
One in a long line of curious decisions made by Philadelphia's front office. But we talked about this, I think it was a few episodes ago. Tyler Dello, you can follow him on Twitter at Dello Hockey, mentioned he showed shot charts, and we had actually noticed this already, how the shot locations are coming from further and further. Like they're being either boxed out from the net more effectively by other teams. They're not able to get in there. And again, it's not just happening to one of them, it's happening to more than one, which makes me think it's a systems thing. Or they're being told to shoot there. Like that's where they're being told to set up and get shots from. This isn't where you should have your elite players trending towards. Like you want them closer to the net. You don't want them being pushed out further for obvious reasons, or any player, let alone elite.
What if the players, Brian, what if these players are just like older and like not as good, and so they just are getting forced there? It has nothing to do with coaching. The coach is saying, no, go to the good places.
That is possible. We have talked about guys who have lost a step skating or physically, and they can't sort of push their way into scoring areas as effectively as before. But this really does seem to be a systemic thing. Like Giroux's 29, and we've talked about potential injury issues affecting him before. I don't think that's what this is. I'm not sure what's happening here, but to see the production of two elite players disappear as drastically as it did last season makes me think that it's not either one of them to blame. And I have another reason to be concerned about Dave Haxtell's choices behind the Flyers bench, and that's in Claude Giroux's ice time. After 5 consecutive seasons in which Giroux averaged 20.5 minutes of ice time per game or more, Giroux skated for just 19 minutes on average this past season, and he actually played his biggest minutes towards the start of the year. If you isolate the start of the year and look at just the last half of the season, he was averaging just 18.5 minutes of ice time. That's 2 or 3 minutes fewer per game than what he's used to seeing over the last 5 years, and it's like bordering on second line minutes rather than no doubt or first line, which is what Claude Giroux is. And sometimes, again, we can explain that away to a nagging injury, but look at what Giroux did. He went straight to play and put up nice point totals over at the World Championships once the season ended after Game 82, and that puts a pretty solid hole in the theory that he was just injured and being rested for some reason. The silver lining in all of this, by the way, is that Giroux was able to hold perfectly steady on the power play, and his owners still enjoyed his usual contributions there with 26 power play assists and 31 total power play points. But to get all the way back, oh yeah, go ahead. What do you have to say?
Well, no, you're talking about the power play. I was going to point out he was actually elite on the power play. He was tied for 3rd in the league in special teams points. I'm ranking here on Fantrax. So Backstrom, Hedman, which are also like interesting numbers, right? And guys who are probably going to go higher than they went last year. But we're not on that episode. We're on the disappointing players. But consider it's pretty interesting that if you look down this list of top power play point getters, Giroux is the only one that we're going to be talking about today as someone who disappointed us. So it's definitely surprising that someone who was so elite. And usually I find you say that if a player had a really good season, you might be skeptical if a lot of their points came on the power play, because that might be the kind of thing that's harder to repeat the next year. Maybe the team just did better on the power play. So it's very interesting that that was like the place where he was still elite, and he must have fallen so far at even strength considering he only ended with 58 points when he was 3rd in the league in power play points.
Yeah, well, it's nice to see he can put up elite production somewhere. And going back to the whole shot location thing, you look at his power play shot locations, and they are pretty similar over the last 3 years. There are no large fluctuations. Not that the fluctuations are terribly huge at even strength, but they're noticeable. Whereas power play, he's still shooting from like just above the face-off dot on the left-hand side, as he always has. Anyway, to go back to your original question about whether 4 straight years of decline for Claude Giroux and his numbers, that means that he's getting old and that's what we should expect going forward. I don't think that's the case here. Has he lost his point per game edge? That is entirely possible. But 86, 73, 67, 58, as you read it, that is not a normal aging curve for ages 26 through 29. Far too sharp of a drop at the back end of it, where he goes from 73 points to 58 points just in the matter of 2 years. Well, 67 to 58 points in 1 year is enough to be curious. So I think dropping as low as he did last season makes a bounce back for me, from my perspective, as the guy who's trying to call it, all that easier to call. He's not a sub 60 point player, so it's easy for me to say he's going to bounce back. One thing that I think can really help Claude Giroux is a new coach and a new system. There are two ways he can get it. Dave Haxtell is replaced within the first month or two of the season, or Giroux is dealt away to another team, which I did suggest also a few episodes ago, that the Flyers, maybe they should maximize these assets that they have if they don't think they're going to win while these guys are still contributing elite numbers. So all in all, I'd be more confident calling Giroux a 70-point player next year with some sort of coaching change. Without it, I'll stick to a cautious 65. But in any case, if he falls outside the first 2 rounds in your draft, you've likely got a shot at a player with 70-point upside later in your draft than you normally would. And that's something that you can take advantage of if you're up for taking, well, it depends how you perceive the risk. I'm ready to jump on him if he's available in my 3rd round and definitely 4th.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It seems like there's different types of strategies when you're drafting in a 1-year league. And I keep saying a 1-year league just because everything kind of goes out the window when you're in a keeper league. And, a guy like Jake Gensel is a lot more valuable in a keeper league than in a 1-year league. But I'll bet you there's a lot of people who would rather have Gensel than Claude Giroux at this point. I haven't seen anyone saying that Gensel's going to be like lower than 60. He's having such an amazing playoffs and everyone's so excited about him. Meanwhile, Claude Giroux had this lackluster season. Brian, I assume you would draft Claude Giroux over a Jake Gensel, forgetting about like position eligibilities, or even with position eligibilities, because I guess that makes Giroux less valuable since he's only center eligible.
Yeah, with position eligibilities considered. I mean, sometimes Giroux gets that right wing. In fact, usually he gets that right wing eligibility. So, yeah, that's a tough one. I think I would go Giroux. I could see a lot of people going Gensel.
Yeah, I just feel like there's a floor issue here where Claude Giroux, even if he's like horrible, and I guess he has been going down each year, and each year we probably
65-point floor though.
He had 58 points last year. But okay, but even, but I agree with you. Like, yeah, probably 60, 65-point floor. Gensel, and I don't, and this isn't the Jake Gensel show right now, but I feel like a guy like Gensel, sure, unbounded upside. Like, if he plays with Crosby, if he's on the power play, like, he could, who knows what he can do? He could get 75 points. Like, I wouldn't blow me away if he did that. But I feel like there is a lower floor there because you have, even if you're the biggest Gensel backer, it's definitely more likely that he ends up somehow on the 3rd line in Pittsburgh. Like, he has a few bad weeks and the coach shakes things up and he's off the power play and off a good line. That's not really going to happen with Giroux. Like, I know you said that he had kind of like 2nd line minutes, but that's the worst I could imagine coming from Claude Giroux. So I feel like you're taking a bit more of a risk drafting a guy like Gensel, and that depends on how you want to play. You could win your pools with some lucky picks, not lucky, but with some risky picks if they pay off. Depends which way you want to go, higher ceiling or like lower floor. It's 2 different strategies. But where'd he go?
I was just giving you the thumbs up. I had nothing to add. It was very, very solid rundown. The way you put it, I don't see how anyone could listen to that argument and think Jake Gensel is the one they want. Is it inconceivable that Jake Gensel outscores Claude Giroux? No, not inconceivable. No, not inconceivable. But yeah, I think Giroux definitely has the higher floor, and you can really count on him for, again, 65 points, still has upside for 70 as a super talented player who is still an elite producer on the power play.
I mean, that's not exactly what I said, right? I didn't say that. I wasn't trying to make an argument that for sure you take Giroux over Gensel. I think that Gensel has higher upside than Giroux. So how about that? So I think that the possibility for a higher number of points comes from Gensel. And then there's also the idea of his trade value, but I would take Giroux personally. My strategy is, especially early in my pool, I want to have a really high floor, a guy that I know I'm going to really be able to depend on, because I feel like there's lots of guys like the Gensels, and I should throw out some other names, right? Like, who knows? Who should I say? Ricard Raquel, someone who out of nowhere was a really valuable fantasy producer and you're able to grab him pretty late. There's guys like that are always going to pop up in your draft late or even like later in the year. But a guy like Claude Giroux, you have to get him early in the draft. You're not going to get him at all. But who knows? Like, this is definitely, if he goes down again next year, we're going to be having a very different discussion, I think. I feel like this is a make or break year for him. If he gets 60 points this year, I doubt you're going to be calling him 65, 70 point guy next year. So I agree with your call, and I think you're right, and hopefully he'll be able to prove you right, and then we could discuss as he goes into his age 30 year what we'll think of him. But okay, I was talking about power play producers and how Giroux is so high up in that list, even though he's on our list of players who had disappointing seasons. So I was looking down the list of power play producers trying to see who's the next guy in the rankings for power play points. That's someone we were planning on talking about today. And I have to go all the way down to number 50, where I land on Anze Kopitar, which is the next guy I want to bring up right now. Giroux, we're disappointed in his 58 points. How about Kopitar's 52 points in 76 games played with only 12 goals and 150 shots to go along with it? Kopitar, let's admit it, he was barely worth rostering in most fantasy formats. Like maybe in a very deep league, 52 points is decent, but like without many shots on goal and I guess 19 power play points, like I said, good for 50th in the league. It's okay, but like in a 12-team league, you were holding on to Kopitar because you were expecting him to do better, not because you were satisfied with his production. And this is another guy that seemed like a lock for around 70 points pretty much every year of his career. Like after the lockout, we're looking at 70, 64, 74. So I guess he did have that 64-point drop a couple seasons ago, but generally he's always been 70 or higher. And this year, like I said, 52. Can we blame this on LA's lack of depth? We talked all season long about Kopitar's crappy line mates and how, like, what's that guy again that you really liked because he went through a lot of adversity to get back into the NHL? What was it, like alcohol problems? Who was that?
Oh, Devin Setoguchi.
Yeah, he was playing with Devin Setoguchi, which is great for Devin Setoguchi coming back to LA and having a nice end probably to his career, getting to play with Anze Kopitar. But come on, you can't find someone better for an elite guy like Kopitar to play with. So, you know, I wonder if maybe we have to accept that LA just, because there's the kind of three ways to go. Like either Kopitar's still really good, but did badly because he had bad line mates. But then you have to ask the question, is he going to have better line mates next year? Or maybe is he just not as good himself? Like had he had better line mates in the past when he was getting all of these points? And then even the guys who we thought were pretty decent line mates, like I feel like we have to tie them in here. Like Tyler Toffoli is a guy who was playing with Kopitar some of the time, and he only had 34 points in 63 games, which is a 44-point pace, which is definitely not fantasy relevant in most leagues. And this is a guy who had 58 points the year before. So a big drop from Toffoli probably contributed to Kopitar having such a weak season. I guess I'm just curious. Let's start with Kopitar though. Like what happened with him? 150 shots, blech, like 52 points, blech. Like should people be drafting him next year in like the top 50, top 100?
Yes, will be my short answer. And of course, I've got a very long answer. But before I get into it, Devin Setoguchi, it was very nice while he played with Kopitar, but it wasn't that much, just 84, 85 minutes on the whole season. So that was just a thing that happened, and we noticed it because a couple points came of it, and it made for some good chat on the podcast. But all in all, pretty impactless on the whole. But you're onto something with the lack of depth thing. First, let's talk straight up about Anze Kopitar head on. One of the postseason quotes out of LA on Kopitar was the newly minted GM Rob Blake speaking about Kopitar's conditioning, that the soon-to-be 30-year-old Kopitar needs to do more to be at his optimal fitness level than he had to do in his early to mid-20s. So that's a little, I don't know if it's a wink-wink, nudge-nudge, but like Blake is publicly airing concerns about Kopitar's off-season routine with the seeming intent to light some sort of fire or to make things very, very clear to Kopitar, because these are things he could just say in person without having to embarrass him to, you know, the LA and hockey press. But here's the thing about that comment that sort of makes me wonder exactly where it's coming from. Not, of course, like Rob Blake has probably the biometric data on Anze Kopitar through the season, so I'm not someone to question that, but I am questioning, like, the narrative Kopitar built this season doesn't really go hand in hand with fitness issues. If you look, Kopitar started this season in 2 separate tournaments before he played his first regular season game. Remember, he played for Slovenia's Olympic qualification before even the World Cup tournament, and then he was an anchor for Team Europe in the World Cup, and an anchor in a good way.
By the way, I didn't know that he was playing on Slovenia's Olympic qualification. How did that go? Did they make it?
Oh, come on, putting me on the spot. I feel like they did. I feel like it was a good story at the time. I just can't remember if it was this particular round or another round. And I think his dad coaches the team. He single-handedly carries them through their group. And it's very fun to watch the celebrations and see Slovenia have some degree of hockey success. But back on track. So
no, off track again. But how will it work? Because Kopitar, like, he's allowed to play in the qualification round, even though NHL players aren't going to be allowed in the Olympics. It seems like just giving them false hope.
This was before that decision was made. Yes,
right.
If Slovenia has to go into the Olympics without Anze Kopitar, I think they're in pretty big trouble. But I think maybe they play a good system. I don't know. I don't have the most to say about the Slovenian national team. Maybe for another show. So anyway, if fitness is the primary concern of Kopitar, you think then, he played 2 tournaments before the season even started, and then maybe you'd think he'd start strong in the NHL season, but then would see his production fade off towards the end of the year. But it's the opposite that seemed to happen. He played very well in both preseason competitions, and then he scored at a 50-point pace for the first 3 quarters of the season, which is not good for Anze Kopitar. But then Kopitar finally started doing what we expect from him point-wise. Over the last quarter of the year, he had 6 goals, 13 assists for 19 points over his last 22 games, including 9 power play points, rewarding any Puli who traded for him or held on to him or took whatever chance they had to take on him to have him around for their fantasy playoffs. That nice run of 19 points in 22 games began just a few games before the Kings acquired Jerome Iginla at the deadline. And I do think that Iginla coming helped sustain that run. It helped Kopitar offensively, not to say it did him any favors at all defensively. In fact, quite the opposite. But look at his most common line mates before Iginla came around to maybe help out with some offense. Marian Gaborik, Dustin Brown, Trevor Lewis, Dwight King. Kopitar is good, but he's not a miracle worker, especially when he's also doing the defensive heavy lifting and often facing other teams' best forwards. So yeah, I do think the Kings' depth did come into play for much of the season. But pile onto that a career low even strength shooting percentage, which accounts for a loss of about 6-7 goals, give or take. And you look at his shot locations over the last few years, they were less concentrated around net front this year than they usually have been. His shots were stretching into the higher slot and around it. Maybe there's something to consider there, though certainly some of his own troubles were plain bad, quote-unquote, luck/variance. And of course, Kopitar had a career low even strength on ice shooting percentage, which can largely be attributed, well, to his own struggles and to the low shooting acumen of his most frequent line mates. One thing to remember for anyone drafting Kopitar or thinking about drafting Kopitar is that his game definitely has changed over the last few years. So if you're looking for Kopitar from 2 or 3 years ago, I'm not sure he's there anymore. You can no longer expect 25, 30 goals on 230 shots. In fact, that was longer than 2 or 3 years ago. But assuming that the Kings find a way to offer him some more offensively capable line mates, you could still safely count on 15 to 20 goals and 170 shots with hopefully 45, 50 assists if he has someone to set up. I think he can do that. And the Kings have committed already with the coaching and GM change. They said they want to activate their offense more often. Now, they have some cap constraints they have to work through to be able to provide him with some real help up front. But even if they don't, well, actually, not even if they don't. If they don't, I am afraid that Kopitar does continue taking a hit in his numbers. Maybe he can will himself to 60 points, playing with the likes of Brown and Gaborik and Lewis again next year. But he can certainly get there and have 70 in his sights with some more capable skaters alongside him.
So it sounds like you're saying the way the lineup's looking now, you're not drafting him for higher than 60 points. I guess like there's a couple good players. Right? Like Jeff Carter is awesome. He had an amazing year, but he got, I guess, the Tanner Pearson linemate, and he had a pretty good year himself. And I guess Toffoli was usually like Toffoli with Pearson and Jeff Carter. And so Kopitar was getting like the Dustin Browns and the Marian Gaboriks. Like that would have been a good line 5-10 years ago, actually. That would have been pretty good. But yeah, so I guess it sounds like you're saying we're going to need to see some more. Like, is there any other player aside from Tanner Pearson and Tyler Toffoli and then Kopitar and Jeff Carter that you like as a forward on LA to be worth drafting in fantasy? I don't see anybody.
You said aside from Kopitar and Carter?
And then I guess on the side, and then I guess, yeah, on the side, like Toffoli and Tanner Pearson. Tanner Pearson had a pretty good year.
Well, how about Drew Doughty?
Well, yeah, so on defense.
I know you just meant forwards. Yeah, Tyler Toffoli is the other guy. Tanner Pearson, borderline. You can go for that if you've got a gut feeling about him, but I'm not sure he's anything more than a 50-point player, 55 in your best case scenario. But I think you want me to talk more about Tyler Toffoli right now. So that's what I'm going to do.
Oh, no.
What do you say?
Sure. Go for it.
Is that what you're going for?
I wasn't really going for anything. I was making chit chat.
But we have Tyler Toffoli to talk about.
All right. Do it. Wait, is that a good lead in? No. How about let me always forget I even asked you that. That's just for the people who joined us live.
Well, you had a great question to lead into Tyler Toffoli, so I was waiting for you to get there instead of dancing around
What did I
him.
ask again? Remind me.
Are Kopitar's fortunes tied to another disappointment in Tyler Toffoli?
Oh yeah.
That's how I framed my answer,
All right,
man.
so I'm gonna go back. Okay, I got it.
Sheesh.
All right, so you're saying basically you like Kopitar. Okay. All right, so you're saying basically you're not gonna go back to a 70-point Kopitar unless you see some improvement. Unless you see some improvement in his line mates. You know, we could look at Tyler Toffoli, who, like I said, had a very disappointing season. Of course, he generally plays with Jeff Carter, right? And Kopitar's playing with guys like Gaborik and Dustin Brown, which would be a good line from maybe 5-10 years ago. But I did want to talk about Toffoli because he's another guy that I think people were excited about going into this year. Not Kopitar level, but still definitely someone that was drafted in pretty much all leagues. And like I said, he was totally irrelevant. Like Tanner Pearson was definitely someone I would have wanted over Toffoli for most of this year. So what do you think about Toffoli? Is he a guy that you would draft? Like, is he going to be a good, sneaky, late round pick? Because that's probably where you're going to be able to get him. Or do you think leave him in the free agency and then see if he does anything before picking him up?
He should definitely be somebody worth drafting, or at least considering drafting towards the tail end of your draft, depending on how deep your draft goes, and maybe even before the tail end of your draft. A lot of people might have been concerned, including you, Elon. I know you were asking me if Toffoli and Kopitar's fortunes might be tied together, and that would be a reason to not expect much from Toffoli if you're not going to expect much from Kopitar. You know, he and Kopitar, they played roughly 480 even strength minutes together over the last 2 years. So they're far from being attached to the hip. So it's hard to necessarily make the connection between one producing and the other producing. That's like only somewhere around 30 games total over the last 2 seasons when they did play together for the majority of them. But it's worth pointing out that when they do play together, they both definitely see a bump in their on-ice goals for rates. Toffoli did get to play most of last year with Toffoli did get to play most of last year with Jeff Carter and Tanner Pearson, which, you know, they're no slouches either, so that's a pretty good situation. And to be honest, nothing really changed for Toffoli himself between this season and the one before it, except for the one thing we warned you would change going into last season, which was his even strength shooting percentage. In his 30-goal season, it was up over his individual shooting percentage at 5-on-5 was up above 12%. And then this year, it was down to 6.5%, which sounds low in a vacuum, but it's about not so far off what you would expect when his career number hovers around 9%. In fact, it's lower than you would expect to the extent that 12% was higher than you would expect. So maybe there was a bit of an overcorrection there from 12 all the way down to 6.5%. You know, his on-ice shooting percentage, that didn't look so good either, but some regression was due. Perhaps not this much. Toffoli is still a very good hockey player. He can score 20 goals, no problem. I think he could still manage 25 in a good year, and I've got him finishing a little closer to 58 points, which he had 2 years ago, than 44 points that he had last year. And some extra power play time, by the way, it certainly wouldn't hurt him. He's never really gotten top billing, being the 4th forward in the power play pecking order in LA, which is a team that still likes to play a 3-forward, 2-defenseman configuration when they have the man advantage. And I think it's inevitable that that changes for every team across the league. Enough has been written and shared to know that that 4 forwards, 1 defenseman is almost always the better way to run your power play. If the Kings do go in that direction, I think he should be the beneficiary who can then be counted on for more than just the 9 power play points he was on pace for last year.
Well, I mean, 2 seasons ago, I think he was getting more power play time. Like last year, he got bumped by the guy who you're never into, Tanner Pearson. Like Tanner Pearson was getting top power play time for most of the season, and that's who bumped Tyler Toffoli. But yeah, if they go to 4 forwards, then all 4 of them could play along with Drew Doughty. But that would then bump a guy like Jake Muzzin, who's another disappointing player on LA.
Yes, you can continue about Jake Muzzin, but just Toffoli had 11 power play points last year. 9 of those power play goals. He had a great power play shooting percentage as well last season, but the difference between 11 and 9 isn't that huge. I would love to see him a little closer to 15, but yes, 11 over 9 is a start.
Right. Okay. So let's go to defensemen. So there's a lot of disappointing LA Kings players. Don't even get me started on Jonathan Quick, who was disappointing in another way, just in that he was injured for all of the season. But yeah, Jake Muzzin was a guy who was really cementing himself as a solid fantasy defenseman, especially in bangers and mash leagues where you're counting your hits and your blocks. He was coming off 2 straight 40-point campaigns. So, a solid 40-point defenseman who gets power play time and who gets some blocks for you. This is a guy that was being drafted in most leagues. I was definitely targeting him in the couple. I think that in my auction draft, I was unfortunately outbid on him. Like other people liked him more than I did, which, I'm glad I didn't get him because he had a very disappointing season. Only 28 points in 72 games. And like I said, before that, he had a couple seasons closer to 40 points, and he had fewer shots on goal, hits, and blocks than he did in 2015-16. So all across the board, even in the peripheral categories, Jake Muzzin took a hit. We all remember we were talking about how Alec Martinez took his job on the power play for a lot of the time. I think by the end of the year, he was getting back in there, but it didn't, give him enough. I think he was okay at the end of the season, but obviously the people who drafted him had probably long since dropped him. So where do you see a guy like Muzzin for next year? I'm not expecting fireworks. I think 40 points is a decent ceiling, but I thought that was also around his floor. I thought he was just a good solid bet to get you 40 points. Now I don't know. I would draft him if he's going to get me 40 points and those hits and those shots and some power play points. I would for sure draft him in my league, probably like decently high. I like a guy like that on my team. Do you think I could rely on him to get back to 40 points? Or now you're kind of concerning me more if you think that they're going to go to 4 forwards on the power play, that gives him even less of a chance of getting back up to 40 points because there's no way he's bumping Drew Doughty, right?
No, there's no way he's bumping Drew Doughty. And there was enough concern when he conceded his power play spot to Alec Martinez early on this past year. And but by the end of the season, it seemed like he had reclaimed the mantle of the second best power play defenseman, finishing with more cumulative power play time on ice than Martinez had, and also more game-to-game opportunity down the stretch on the power play. But even with that power play time, he wasn't cashing in a ton, scoring about a point per hour less than he had managed in his 2 previous seasons. And he also wasn't getting in on as many goals as he had in those seasons either. That only amounted to about 3 or 4 fewer points than in previous years. But that is the difference between 35 and 40 points on the back end. Of course, Jake Muzzin, with his awful season last year, he's still missing like 7 or 8 even strength points to get back up to 40. They can be partially accounted for by a decreased even strength IPP. The rest, to be honest, I'm not really sure where it went because he still looks pretty good on paper. Looking ahead to next year to see where he slots in, LA is a team whose decor could be impacted by the expansion draft. So first off, be wary of that when you're trying to project him at this point of the offseason. But we also heard that the Kings, like I said, are looking for more offensive help from their defensemen. And we'll see if, first that they follow through on that strategy. And then if Muzzin gets to be a piece of that strategy, which I do think he's capable of being, yes, maybe that extra power play time never really comes back, which does jeopardize him being a reliable 40-point player. But I'm still into a solid 35, hopefully 40-point campaign from him.
Yeah, so we'll see in our patron rankings if a guy like Jake Muzzin or if a Tyler Toffoli even gets ranked by the time we get there. Okay, Brian, how about before we go on to our next player? And I have some more defensemen I want to talk about. This was a big year, by the way, for defensemen disappointing us. The year we talked about this on our patron cast last Wednesday, how the year that I decided to draft a whole bunch of defensemen was the year that they pretty much all stunk. We're going to get into a couple more of them in a minute. But first, why don't we take a minute to thank the sponsor of today's episode of Keeping Karlsson, and that is our friend SeatGeek. Okay.
Is SeatGeek our friend, or is it like the people who are at SeatGeek our friends? Or are we actually friends with the app itself?
Well, SeatGeek is my friend because the app helps me to find tickets to concerts and sporting events in such an easy way. Sometimes buying tickets for these things can be really complicated, but with SeatGeek, it makes it easy. It's the smartest, easiest way to get tickets to live events. With SeatGeek's seamless mobile experience, you can buy and sell tickets in just 2 taps, and SeatGeek helps you to find the best seats at the best prices, fully guaranteed. There's nothing quite like seeing your favorite team or musician in person, and SeatGeek will get you closer to the action for great value. I really like how they rank things by value, so you can not only see by price, but sometimes wonder, am I getting a good deal? It's cheaper because the seat sucks, or the seat's really expensive, but maybe it's worth it. So I want to know the whole story, and SeatGeek does a great job of filtering by that. So I would say that if you want to go somewhere, and you should, it's the summer, go to a show, go to an outdoor show at the Budweiser stage. I think Jack Johnson, not the hockey player, was there in Toronto just recently. I wonder if any of our patron friends went there. I know that patron Dave always changes his team name to Banana Pancakes whenever he has Jack Johnson on his team. Or at least that was my experience, like a couple this season. Brian, wait, what am I talking about? SeatGeek? Oh, yeah. They also give you even a better deal if you sign up just because you're a listener of Keeping Karlsson. So why don't you tell our listeners about that?
Wow. If you want a friend who finds you tickets easily to concerts and events and hockey games and the like, you can download the app or head to the website, put in the promo code KEEPING when you sign up, and SeatGeek will give you a $20 rebate on your very first purchase.
How about that? 20 American dollars. So check it out, SeatGeek. Like Brian said, offer code KEEPING. How about we get back to some players that a lot of people are wondering if they should be keeping because they were so bad last year. And I think one of the guys that I really want to get your take on, there's a lot of defensemen I could choose from, but I want to go right to Oliver Ekman-Larsson on Arizona. We talked about him a bit on the Patroncast, and it really got me thinking, like, man, this is a hard guy to peg. On one hand, we used to love him. He had 55 points in 75 games 2 seasons ago. Previously, he had been more of a 45-point guy, which is still pretty good for a defenseman, but we really saw something special coming out of him, especially on a team that doesn't score that much. Then last year, it all fell apart. 39 points in 79 games, which is brutal. He also only had 145 shots, as opposed to the well over 200 that he had in the previous couple of seasons. But the thing with Arizona is that it looks like the future is bright. Like, I feel like on the last Patroncast, Brian, you were listing there was a question that we had about which rookies and which sophomores do we expect to break out next year. And like, so many names came out of Arizona, like Clayton Keller, Dylan Strome. You mentioned D'Angelo, Christian Dvorak, as some people have talked about. Plus they have Max Domi, who we're still waiting for him to make that breakup that, a lot of people have projected that he'll do. Jacob Chikrin is like looking like a good piece. Like, there's a lot of good pieces on Arizona, which makes me think they could be the type of team that could score a lot of goals soon. And Oliver Ekman-Larsson is the core power play defenseman. Plus there was that news that he had an injury last year, which makes me have some solace, or gives me some idea that maybe he could have been better if things were a little different, and maybe next year he'll be healthy and the team will be better and they'll have all these good players. So it makes me think you got to keep him, you got to draft him high, but at the same time, he had 39 points last year. So maybe I'm just trying to tell a story of why I think he's good, but maybe they're like not a good team. And maybe that 55-point year, which was much higher than he'd ever done before, maybe that was a mirage. And maybe he's just a maybe he's just a 40 to 45 point defenseman, and that's just how he is, and he doesn't even take a lot of shots anymore. So I have no idea. Like, I could see him landing with 40 points next year. I could see him landing with like 55 points next year, and that's a huge variance for a defenseman. So Brian, can you help solve this puzzle and try to project where we expect Oliver Ekman-Larsson to land next year when it's all said and done?
Well, going into last season, we were warning people 55 points in 75 games the season before in 2015-16. That was too high. That wasn't really supposed to happen. And we were saying temper your expectations. 45, 50 points would be nice, but he gets you a bucket load of shots from the blue line, which few others can parallel, at least in terms of defensemen. So that's where good extra chunk of his value is. And then not only does he not come close to those 55 points, which again, we warned about, but he doesn't even come close to those 45 points with just 39 points in 79 games. And to top that off, he has a massive drop in shots on goal and shot attempts at both even strength and on the power play. Like, this is a guy who made a name for himself as one of the heaviest volume blue line shooters in the NHL, and that's how he got his points. Then this year, his even strength shots on goal rates, they fell by a third, and his power play shot on goal rates were literally halved. For anyone who doesn't look at these numbers that often, is like, is that good? Is that bad? That is not good. That is awful. And all I can think of to explain how bad it is like, it must be this hand injury that he apparently played through all year long. It's the only explanation I can come up with for such a drastic drop in his shot taking and shot attempting numbers. Now, why would Arizona let him do that? Let him play through a hand injury as like a young cornerstone of the franchise in a year that was pretty much over for them before it started? I have no idea. But the Coyotes were suddenly taking a lot fewer shots from along the blue line with Ekman-Larsson on the ice, and I can't imagine any other reason Why? It's not like they had anyone new on the roster who needed to suddenly have the puck more often and carry some of that shooting load. Which is why I think there is great bounce back possibility for Ekman Larsson. I don't think you're just being optimistic. The only thing that would mean the only thing that would work, the only reason to temper your optimism is if you think that, hey, this is an actual systemic shift that the Coyotes did intentionally and has nothing to do with Ekman Larsson playing through a potential hand injury all of last season. That would just be entirely bizarre, though, and a lot less likely for being the reason for the decline in Oliver Ekman Larsson's shots on goal totals and shot attempts totals. The tough part is having Oliver Ekman Larsson, even if he does get those numbers to rebound, put more pucks on net again, he's got to rely on so many question marks to convert rebounds and help create offense. Like, you look at the list of players, and you went through them already, but if Clayton Keller, Dylan Strome, Christian Dvorak, and all the others, all those company and all the others, if they all click pretty quickly, that is gravy for Ekman Larsson. That's a great situation. But if not, then it's just OEL, Max Domi, and, well, that's it. Those would be the only two reliably offensive players locked in on that roster at the moment, with Hansel being shipped out late last season to Minnesota and Radim Verbata going to free agency. But Ekman Larsson has produced on some poor teams before, and with the return of his usual shot volume, I still think he's capable of rebounding I still think he's capable of rebounding at least back up to 45 points.
And do you think he's capable of rebounding back to 200 plus shots?
Were you listening?
You said yes, right?
Absolutely. Yes. To be absolutely clear, I think he will get back above 200 shots. Assuming, again, like, I just shared my theory that he was injured and it wasn't a systemic thing or anything. If it was, and that it wasn't a systemic thing or anything, if it was systemic, then may God have mercy on our souls.
Yeah, well, okay. Well, I mean, I think we'll get over it. But I guess unless you're a really diehard Arizona fan. Do those exist, by the way? If you're a diehard Arizona Coyotes fan, can you tweet at us at Kevin Karlsson? Because I'd like to meet you.
I think Austin Matthews was a Coyotes fan.
Oh, there you go. I guess if you're born there. All right. Here's the thing. So then, I mean, the way you're speaking, and I feel that this must be right, but maybe if everyone's thinking of this, then it's not a big surprise or a big secret, but Oliver Ekman Larsson could be a really good guy to target in the keeper league right now. His value probably won't be lower. Like, I doubt he's going to get lower than 39 points next year. And so now's your time to go and get him if you really like all of these young players on Arizona. And we've been spending the last couple of episodes talking up Clayton Keller. Like, your whole interview with Carolyn Wilkie started with her just talking about how Clayton Keller was like one of the best players in the World Championship tournament. So it's a good time to maybe be an OEL owner or to try to get him if you're not. And as far as drafting him next year, that's always tricky because on one hand, you feel like you should be able to get him at a discount because he had a bad season. So you're going to wait and wait. But at some point, you have to pounce and you have to pick him and you want to know but you don't want to like waste a pick when you could have just gotten the same guy in the next round. So it's always very tricky with draft strategy. And we'll get into that maybe later on in the summer series, some draft strategies and how to try to optimize and get some of these value guys. It's crazy that I'm calling Oliver Ekman Larsson a value guy, but a 39-point defenseman, I guess it'll depend what people think about him. But yeah, there's a lot going into deciding when to draft him. But I like what you're saying. I feel like he should be a 45-point guy. And if you get all those shots, that makes him very valuable in fantasy. And then all this extra upside if Arizona becomes a high-scoring team. All right, let's do one more defenseman. There's a lot I could talk about. Like Aaron in the chat at the beginning of the show wanted to talk about Tyson Barrie. And I feel like, even PK Subban had an off year, Justin Falk. Like, there's a lot of defensemen. But how about we go to Calgary? I want to ask you, are we done with 50-plus point Mark Giordano? He only had 39 points in 81 games last year after putting up 47 and then 47 the year before that. And those were both in like 64 and 61 games. So well over 50-point paces the previous two seasons. He had 56 points last year, he had 56 points then 2 seasons ago. So I'm just talking about the last few years. He's been well over 50 points. But last year, like I said, only 39 points, which I guess is actually the same as Oliver Ekman Larsson. Look at that. I could have used that as the segue. Another guy who got 39 points. Obviously, their career trajectories are going in opposite directions just because of their ages. Mark Giordano's 33 years old compared to OEL being 25. But we've seen some defensemen in the past, including Brent Burns, put up good numbers well into their mid-30s. But at the same time with Calgary, they have a new stud D-man, Dougie Hamilton. I wonder if he's the reason why Mark Giordano is starting to dip, just because they have other people that they could depend on now, even though it was actually TJ Brody who was getting the majority of the top power play time, if I recall, which was pretty weird. But anyway, yeah, what do we do with a guy like Mark Giordano, especially in a league that counts blocks? He can be really valuable because he gets so many blocks. And when he was putting up 50 points, 50 plus points, like we're talking closer to a 55, 60 point pace over those last few seasons. He was a real stud, a guy that you wanted to draft really high. Maybe he was a little overrated, but like really a good producer. How risky would it be to use an early pick on Giordano next season? Like, do you think that 39 point season last year is the new normal for him? Or do you think he could get back to being a 50 point guy?
I'm going to lean towards the latter. I don't think you'd be wasting a pick if you're at the part of your draft where you're looking at 50-point D-men, maybe 45, 50-point D-men. I think Giordano is a good bet at that point. And to explain why, I'm going to again invoke coaching to try and explain what happened with Mark Giordano last year. If you rewind to the start of last season in Calgary, you're going to find Glenn Gulutzan just settling in behind the bench for his first year with the Flames, playing with two brand new goalies and trying to implement a new system. You'll also find Johnny Gaudreau putting up just 7 points in 13 games over the first month of the season, driving poolies crazy. And you're also going to find Sean Monahan putting up just 8 points in 24 games over the first 7 weeks of the season. And then, of course, you'll find Mark Giordano struggling too. He did all right for the first handful of games. He was actually one of the top scorers in the first 5 or 6 games. But then he found himself with just a single assist over a 12-game span through late October and mid-November. But soon, after Gulutzan was done mixing and matching defensive pairings and trying to figure out who plays best with who and what to expect from this guy, Giordano ended up playing with Dougie Hamilton and putting up the best shot attempt share numbers of his career. Now, yes, production-wise, Giordano was no better than a 42, 43-point defenseman for any length of time for most of the first 3 quarters of the year, but he finished the season with 6 goals and 11 assists for 17 points and 24 games as Calgary racked up that massive win streak that locked themselves into a playoff spot. Now, even with that whole narrative of everybody struggling in Calgary at the start and Giordano's still doing okay, but then really not doing anything, but picking it up at the end, I'm not trying to say we should look straight past this 39-point campaign and say, it's no big deal, because we were hoping for 10, 15, even 20 points more from him at the start of the year. But the first couple months in the year in Calgary were really kind of a wash, and he was able to recover fairly well from that point on, scoring at a 44-point pace for over the final 61 games scoring at a 44-point pace over the final 61 games of last season. He did have a lower personal shooting percentage and a lower IPP than he's ever had since becoming a marquee scoring defenseman. And even with those drops, he still didn't have that disappointing of a year, given some context and forgiving that first quarter. He did see a 60-shot drop from last year's numbers, though. He did see a 60-shot drop from the season before that's numbers, though. That came partially as a result of his lowest average time on ice in a few years. It's not quite such a ghastly drop when looking at his rate stats. You can just see, he played fewer minutes. He had fewer chances to get pucks on net. And the same thing shows up in his power play numbers, too. He saw 50 fewer minutes with the man advantage this past season than he did the one before, and a commensurate drop in production there. 14 power play points is what he managed. That's still not bad, but it's 5 fewer than the year before and about equal to what he managed in 20 fewer games in the years before that. So that drop in power play time is actually my biggest concern with Giordano going forward. We were totally vexed last year, remember? You already alluded to it, at how the 4 forward, 1 defenseman setup in Calgary, it had TJ Brody as the defenseman on that unit, and then Dougie Hamilton and Mark Giordano, they shared the other unit. And I don't know if that situation gets any better for Giordano, because ideally, if I'm coaching that team, I'll do the 4 forwards, 1 defenseman, but I might have Hamilton up there ahead of Giordano as the 1 D-man on that unit. Saving grace, though, is that at even strength, if Calgary wants to put their 5 best players on to score a goal, I think he's one of those 5 guys, and I think that should be enough to propel him back towards 50 points. I don't know that those missing even strength and power play minutes are going to come back, though. So I'm going to say that the days of 200 or more shots on goal and more than 55 points could very well be over, and you do have to temper your expectations that way.
Yeah, well, I mean, even 50 points seems like, that would be a really strong bounce back. Like, it sounds like then, are you saying that you think Giordano's going to get more points than Oliver Ekman-Larsson if you were in like a points-only league?
Yeah, I think he's got more upside than Ekman-Larsson. Like I said, Ekman-Larsson is going to need some help scoring in the desert. We don't know if that's going to come or not. And Ekman-Larsson is never a guy that you should expect more than 50 points from. I think Giordano has a higher ceiling.
Yeah, that's fair. And, even being on the second unit in Calgary, I feel like they spread those power plays pretty evenly. Like, you've got Gaudreau and Monahan on one, but you've got Matthew Tkachuk, who you were, talking about how much you liked on our Patreon cast, along with Backlund and Frolik. Like, they made a really good line and also a pretty good power play. With Hamilton and Giordano, that could be pretty good. Maybe they swap out Hamilton to go to the top unit and they get TJ Brody down there. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Yeah, it's tough. But the thing with Giordano is if you're in a league that counts blocks, he's going to help you there. And you'd hope that 39 points is his floor. He is, like, what about his age? Like, being 33, do you expect that that's going to cause him to just get worse and be a worse player regardless of how he's used?
Can you repeat the question?
Just like he's old. Like, do you think that...
What? Okay. Yeah, what?
No, go ahead.
He's old?
I was saying he's 33. Is it possible even if he gets used well, he's just not going to be as good?
Yeah, age is definitely a factor, and I think that's showing up more in his time on ice. I wonder if the Flames are going to just tweak the way he's used in order to sort of ameliorate the effects of aging so that he's not playing quite as often and not getting quite as tired or run down with his older age. But I don't know. I don't think it's enough to hold him back yet. Talk to me again at the end of his contract that expires at age 38.
Well, yeah, that could be a problem in 5 years from now. But okay, while our listeners are off looking up the word ameliorate, great word, I assume. So we're going to stop talking about skaters for a bit. Maybe we'll hit some at the end. Or actually, no, I have one more skater for you. We've been talking about guys who we saw do so well for so many years, then finally had a bad year. Maybe with Oliver Ekman-Larsson, he had some good years, then one great year, then now a bad year. How about a guy who people were so excited about, even though it was only his second season in the league? I'm talking about Dylan Larkin over in Detroit. He went into the season with such high expectations. I remember our patrons, we had a patron, I forget who it was. Please let us know in the patron-only Facebook group if you're listening to this, saying that he was going to, or maybe you won't because you don't want to be embarrassed. He was saying, like, for sure 60 points, upside for 65. Like, people were so excited about Dylan Larkin. And, why not? He did a really good job in his rookie season. He had 18 points in his first 24 games and then ended with 45 points in 80 games. So he did actually peter off during the second half of the year, which made me think maybe he wasn't going to be as good the following year. And, I'm sure there's lots more reasons to it and you'll get into it. But yeah, he really took a step down last year with only 32 points in 80 games. So he went from 45, which is barely fantasy relevant, and, with like upside and, he had spurts where he was doing really well, to like 32 points is nothing. That's a guy that we weren't even considering in fantasy for most of the year. I had him as a free agent in a lot of my leagues and wasn't thinking twice about adding him. At the same time, Dylan Larkin, he's 30. At the same time, Dylan Larkin, he's 20 years old. I feel like who knows, obviously he came into the league with a lot of, with a strong pedigree, and people were talking about him going into his rookie season. Maybe it was just a sophomore slump, if that's a thing. So I'm really curious to know if you would be drafting him next year when he goes into his year 3 in the NHL. Can he get back to being a 50-point guy? Maybe more? What's his ceiling, I guess? I'm not expecting a crazy jump from Dylan Larkin next year, but I'd love to know if you see him as maybe a 50-point ceiling guy at the end of the day for his career, or is he the kind of guy that we think that after a couple of years and once he gets the right deployment and once he, learns how to play in the NHL the proper way for a full season, can you see him as being more like a 60-plus point guy, or are we thinking would that be way too high for a guy like Dylan Larkin?
For the few theories you've thrown out, I'm going to focus on 2 of them. The first is he's only 20 years old. That's the age that he was this past season. The other point I'll focus on is you also just said, does he just need better deployment? Yeah, if you can get better deployment on Detroit, but let me just get into the whole thing now. He wowed us when he was 19 years old. It's hard to remember that he was that young. And so it's okay to not keep flying ahead at such an intense pace at such a young age, especially when there was so much else happening around him that wasn't really helping him any. Now, like, can you just give the guy a pass for having a miserable season last year? Probably not. Like, that's a bit too heavy of a sophomore slump to really just write off. So let's look around and see deployment-wise and usage-wise what was happening around him. Well, the first thing that jumps out at you is that his most common line mate last year was Justin Abdelkader. And then after that, Dylan Larkin played most often with Riley Sheahan, he who failed to score the entire season until the last game at the Joe Louis Arena. Although, to be fair, right after Riley Sheahan, you've got a whole bunch of guys who played a pretty similar amount of minutes with Larkin, like Nyquist, Nielsen, Tatar. But three players who Larkin saw next to no time with, Henrik Zetterberg, Thomas Vanek, and Anthony Mantha, who were arguably the three most successfully offensive Red Wings this season, of course, by virtue this season, and of course, by extension, the most fantasy relevant Red Wings this season. And of all the disappointing Red Wings in 2016-17, I think it's Dylan Larkin who had the least of a chance to be successful, playing often with offensive non-factors and never playing for long enough stretches with higher quality line mates for there to have been a click. I have my greater concerns that I've aired before with Detroit as an organization. Like, what's gotten better in Detroit since Mike Babcock and Jim Nill left the organization? Not to say that they were demigods or something. Like, Jim Nill has certainly made his share of mistakes in Dallas, and Mike Babcock has had some criticism for what he's been doing in Toronto at times, although, like, there's no disputing he's done an amazing job there. But the question is, does Jeff Blashill really know how to get the best out of his players? Because for the 2 years that he's been coach, it's like nothing really positive has happened. He had Larkin's rookie campaign that saw him build himself into a Calder candidate for most of the year. But since then, it's been not a whole lot happening in Detroit that anyone can feel that great about. And as I already mentioned, there's also the sophomore factor. Larkin was able to surprise most opponents. Excuse me. And then getting back to Larkin himself, there also is that sophomore factor. He was able to surprise most opponents in his rookie season because he was super fast. And by the way, he also had Zetterberg as his most common line mate as a rookie. And there was also Pavel Datsyuk to shield him from the bulk of other teams' defensive attention. But that speaks again to situational factors. So maybe teams had more of a chance to build a book on him and know how to focus in on him and shut him down, especially when the guy he's playing with is just an applicator who you don't have to pay a whole lot of attention to. All in all, I still have faith that Dylan Larkin can't be kept at such a low point total for excuse me. Working on it. Oh, good. Lewis is here. I'm glad he could chip in for this Red Wings part. Just a sec.
Maybe a drink of water? There you go. Soothe that throat of yours. Brian talks a lot more in the summer series than I do. So yeah, you got to give him a break here. All right.
Thank you. All in all, I still have faith that Dylan Larkin can't be kept at this low of a point total for long. If you want to look for a silver lining from last year's disappointing season, he did have two of his better runs point-wise towards the end of the year. So that you could take that to mean, if you want, to mean that he and the team as a whole were beginning to figure out what he needs to succeed. But I am still pretty concerned with Detroit, more so with them than I am for him. But hey, me being concerned with them still means that his stock dropped some, even if it's not necessarily his fault. So we'll watch him go into his third season at 21 years old. I'm going to give him a conservative 50 points. But if things click around him and someone gets a clue and figures out a way to get something good out of that Red Wings team, he could be a key cog of that and pass 55 points.
Okay, so you're saying for next year, you think he could bounce back to 50 points, maybe 55. What about longer term? Like, as a keeper, is now a great time to go for him? Like, do you see him as someone who could be a 60-plus point guy a couple years down the road?
In a keep 4 or keep 6 league, I don't think he's much of a keeper. But yeah, if you want to keep someone who has potential to be above 60 points in the future, I think he is a good guy to look at.
And then one more question. So if you're saying 50 points for Larkin next year, I know you've said a lot over last season that you really like Anthony Mantha. Who would you be drafting first between those two guys? Last year, Mantha was the clear winner and he was playing with Zetterberg. But maybe next year, I can't see Mantha getting so much more than 50 points. Maybe you have them pretty close together.
Well, Mantha also got jerked around the depth chart a whole lot too, being given prime opportunities at one point and then seeing them yanked away. I think he was even scratched when he was one of the most offensively productive forwards for a stretch. It's been really weird how Detroit has handled their players. So I think I'm going to go a bit of a cop-out with my answer and say whoever gets the best deployment. Larkin is a center. I think he could be the guy, although, they do have Nielsen who plays the position too.
What's happening?
Sorry. I'm going to call it a toss-up. I want to think it's Larkin, but I think it's probably a negligible difference between the two.
Yeah. And then I guess you could throw someone like Nyquist in there. It's an interesting conversation of who you want to take on Detroit, I guess, after you take Henrik Zetterberg. So speaking of Detroit, how about a guy who's even more disappointing than Dylan Larkin last season? Let's go to a couple of goalies here, and we have to go to Peter Mrazek. This was a guy that seemed like such a solid guy to get. Like in a keeper league, you definitely wanted Peter Mrazek. Now, like Detroit's probably wondering if they even should protect him or Jimmy Howard going into the expansion draft because Mrazek just had such a bad year. So let's take a step back. Let's go back in the past, 2015-16, where he had an amazing season, .921 save percentage in 54 games played. He clearly stole the #1 job from Jimmy Howard. It looked like Howard was going to be a career backup for the rest of his career unless he could move somewhere else because Peter Mrazek was the real deal. And just like with Dylan Larkin, many poolers were excited to draft Mrazek, expecting him to continue to be the #1 goalie in Detroit, putting up above average numbers. And what they got instead with Mrazek was a brutal .901 save percentage. He lost the job to Jimmy Howard. It only took a bunch of Jimmy Howard injuries for Mrazek to end up getting another 50 games. And even when he had those games, he didn't do very well with them. Like I'm saying, I remember there was a couple of times where it looked like maybe he was starting to get things going. And, maybe if Jimmy Howard would stay out, it could be good for him to find his game. But he kept on falling apart. End of the year, like I said, almost below 900. So now we have to decide what to expect for next year. It doesn't seem like you have high hopes for the Red Wings overall, but Mrazek is only 25 and should likely get another shot at being the #1 goalie with Howard, having dealt with injuries all of last year. So I feel like there's still a chance for Mrazek to be a #1 goalie or maybe share the duties. But if you think Detroit's going to be not a great team, I guess then it comes down to, is this like a Corey Schneider situation? We'll get to him, a Corey Schneider from the past situation where a goalie on not a great team, but he could still put up decent numbers, or is he not very good? We haven't seen very much from him in his career. He's still, only done 3 seasons overall. Is he more of the .921 goalie that we saw 2 years ago? Is he more of the .901 goalie that we saw last year, which would make him completely useless? Is he going to be in your tier 5 again come Schmore Goaliesborg, or do you see him being higher or lower?
Being the maybe starting goalie for the Detroit Red Wings means that it's pretty hard to rise above tier 5 in my goalie tiers at the moment. But if you look at what went wrong for him last year, I think part of it is correctable. He fell pretty far in his shorthanded save percentage, which is prone to a fair amount of variance. He was a top 10 goalie in the category in 2015-16, but he fell way down into the bottom third of goalies. In fact, maybe even worse, he was ranked 23rd out of 29 goalies, right behind Corey Schneider on the penalty kill. So that's not a great place to be. That's a good way to kill your numbers. Mind you, his even strength numbers did fall as well. Not totally sure why. It could still be a defensive thing. If you look at what Detroit has on their decor right now, it's not great. They're giving up a lot of high-quality chances. At the same time, it shouldn't matter so much about the team playing in front of you. If you're a good goalie, if you're an NHL average goalie, you should be able to still put up an NHL average save percentage, which is what I think Mrazek is capable of doing.
Okay, well, so not super high hopes, and tier 5 means he's going to be falling below a lot of other goalies in your rankings, but someone to keep in mind, someone that people really liked before, so maybe there is some hope that he can go back to being a useful, second goalie on your team. Probably not. I don't know. I'd maybe take him as my third goalie, as a guy to roll the dice on and hope he could help. Here's a guy, now we've already mentioned him, so let's do the other goalie I really wanted to talk about, Corey Schneider. oof, like just what a bad season for Corey Schneider. Maybe he's the most disappointing guy I have on this whole list. He was likely a top 5 to maybe 8 goalie picked in a lot of leagues, especially ones that count goals against, that count shots against, like saves, and then rate stats, because we expected Schneider to be a guy that, even though New Jersey's not going to get a ton of wins, even though we were optimistic with Taylor Hall coming, and we thought even without a lot of wins, he was going to play a bunch of games, get a lot of saves, have a great save percentage, and it just didn't happen. Like everything that I just said didn't happen. Like even though he put up like a 920 or higher save percentage in each of his past 6 seasons, like everything was pointing to Corey Schneider. He was just going to have another great season. He was even at 925 and 924 in his previous 2 years in New Jersey. Then last year, okay, here it is. Okay, here's what he ended up with: a 908 save percentage in 60 games played. Just a disaster. Like he had been over 920 and then he couldn't even get in the teens. Just a horrible, horrible year. We expected him to bounce back all year long, and while he seemed to be getting back on track with a 928 save percentage in January and a 925 in February, so it looked like, okay, we're back to normal, he ended the year as badly as he started it, putting up a sub 900 save percentage in his last handful of games, or last like 12 games. By the end of the year, he was even splitting time with Keith Kincaid. Like he wasn't even getting consistent time as the starter, though I guess New Jersey didn't have anything to play for. Maybe they even wanted to lose, and maybe it worked. They did get first overall pick in the upcoming entry draft. Anyways, all this said, he is Corey Schneider. He has a big, long career of being very successful behind him, and New Jersey has first overall pick, which we would think means they could potentially be getting better. Pavel Zacha is someone who people think might be able to become a bit of an offensive contributor. Maybe someone who will help New Jersey score some more goals, and maybe eventually they'll score more and win more, but they'll need some decent goaltending. Is this an Oliver Ekman-Larsson situation where his value is at an all-time low and now's the time to potentially pounce on him? Or was last year the start of a decline that we should now expect to continue going into next season for Corey Schneider?
I think you can pounce on Corey Schneider. Granted, you know how much I love Corey Schneider and how much I've loved him for as long as we've been doing the show. But I understand anyone's hesitance to pounce on him. The jarring drop down to a 908 this season after having been a 926 goalie for 5 years before it, that's enough to shake even my own confidence. So here I am. I'm frantically looking everywhere I can to try and restore faith that Corey Schneider can bounce back this year. And this is what I found to sate myself with that. First off, Adam Larsson was gone, so some bigger defensive breakdowns happening for New Jersey. You look at who is there on defense, not many people are there. It's a pretty weak defensive core, and it showed. They were the second worst defensive team in the league, going by Scott using score-adjusted shot attempt share as the way to define a bad defensive team. And for some reason, also, Corey Schneider was just an 843 goalie while on the power play. That's a really weird thing. That's not something we ever look at, power play save percentage. It just means, I don't know, other teams were getting some prime chances and burying them when they were shorthanded. Of course, more importantly, we saw a drop in Corey Schneider's penalty kill save percentage as well. It was down to 854, which puts him right ahead of Peter Mrazek, ranked 22nd out of 29 regular starters in the league. He's been a top 10 goalie in that stat in years past, so this really is a pretty significant drop, one we haven't seen from him before in this category. He wasn't any better in even strength metrics either, which I wish I could rely on to say, look, he was only bad in those weirdly variant situations on the penalty kill and on the power play, that those were the only reasons his numbers tanked the way he did. Those were the only reasons his numbers tanked the way they did, but that's not the reason. He was bad, like just plain old bad. There's no way around it. So why do I think he still got it? Well, I'm just going to go back to what I said at the front. He was a 926 goalie over the 5 years prior to this one. I don't think that just disappears. For next season, I think there's a really good chance he's a bargain for wherever you get to draft him. Think of where Bobrovsky was picked in a lot of leagues this year, and maybe that's the kind of value you can get out of Schneider. Now that New Jersey defense is still a mess, with still nobody in sight to fill the hole left by Larsson's departure, and up front, they don't quite have what Columbus had this year to help support Bobrovsky. But on the whole, like I said, one defenseman gone shouldn't impact save percentage as much as it did for Schneider, if it impacts save percentage at all.
Okay,
So
well,
I
oh,
guess I didn't really conclude there. So to conclude, I think Corey Schneider is good enough to overcome whatever defensive trouble is in front of him. Like maybe his goals against average goes up, but I think his save percentage should return back to at least the 920 level. I'd love to hope for higher, but maybe that's asking a bit too much after a year as bad as this one was.
okay, well, you know how I love to do comparisons now. One name that jumps out at me, a guy who was, I guess, on a better team, but also was like so inconsistent and bad. Like, who would you take between Henrik Lundqvist and Corey Schneider for next year? Because I know you've been really down on Lundqvist and you really like Corey Schneider, but I think that would be a tough one to choose between.
Well, Henrik Lundqvist has been inconsistent. Corey Schneider is in a good year, very consistent, but on a not as good team. Like the Rangers are still a good team, and as we said a couple episodes back, it looks like maybe Alan Vigneault has figured out that his best pairing is not Girardi and McDonough. Maybe he can start relying on Shea and Holden, and that could help Lundqvist out a little bit. Maybe the X factor in this decision, Elon, is if Ranta ends up getting picked off by Vegas, because without him being the backup, if the Rangers don't have a serviceable number two, then Hank is going to have to play a lot. And actually, I'm not sure if that would be a good thing or not for him. He did finish the World Championships with, I think, was it an MCL sprain with some sort of injury? So he's got some recovery to do in the offseason. I think for save percentage, I think Corey Schneider is going to outperform Henrik Lundqvist.
Yeah, I don't know. It's going to be hard to decide where to draft a guy like Schneider. If you could get him as your second goalie on your team, like normally that would be pretty good. If you have a really solid guy who you could depend on for wins, then normally Schneider's the kind of guy that will get you your saves and your save percentage. But last just throws things all in flux. I don't know. You say you like him. Though we'll have to wait a year and then see. And I guess we'll also talk about him a little bit when we do our Schmore Goalies Borg extravaganza episode much later in the summer, probably around August or early September, where you'll give your full goalie tier rankings of which goalies you think are above whom, and we'll see how far down Corey Schneider has fallen. Brian, those are all of the players we've prepared for. I wanted to throw maybe just a couple more at you, a quick sustainable or fleeting round where I can tell you a couple more guys who did really badly. We can just give a quick, I think he'll continue to be bad, which would be sustainable, or I think that his bad production will be fleeting. So sort of the reverse, I guess. You know what I'm saying, right? Is he going to continue to be bad, or is he going to bounce back? We had actually a couple of questions right before you joined to start the show here in the chat room. Aaron wanted us to touch on Huberdeau and Barkov, which are the different types of guys to talk about in a conversation such as this, because they were both really good when they played. It was just injury concerns, but that's something to consider. A bad season, if you're injured for a lot of the season, that's a bad season in terms of how valuable you were to your fantasy owners. Huberdeau started the year injured. Once he came back, he was really good. He was almost a point per game. Barkov was a solid 65 point pace guy, but he got injured again, and now it's 4 straight seasons, and he still has missed over 10 games in each of those seasons he's played. I know you said to me that you don't see Barkov yet as a Band-Aid boy, like someone like Chris Letang, who you just have to depend on being injured. So what do you think for next year? Where would you draft guys like these? Do you expect them to be injured, or do you expect them to just be really solid guys? Maybe you could draft later because they'll be off people's radars because their total points weren't that high.
I don't expect them to be injured. As you already said, I don't see Barkov as a Band-Aid boy, nor do I see Huberdeau that way. I see Barkov as a really high-quality forward, someone who can get to 70 points if he plays 80 games. But of course, I do grant you, he hasn't done that in the last 2 years. He's missed 15 and 20 games respectively. So for that reason, you could probably knock him down a few spaces on your draft rankings list, especially if your draft is with guys who... especially if your draft is with other people who are going just by point totals and not taking into account the points per game element. But yeah, I like him for a 70-point pace, and I like Huberdeau for somewhere between 60, 65.
Yeah, I'd give them each. I think Huberdeau was fine. He had that injury at the beginning of the year, but he was really good. I think he could be a really good sneaky pick. He was really close to a point per game when he was playing, but he only played 32 games or something. So definitely keep him as a guy that you might want to draft as a guy you might want to target come your drafts next year. Another question from Aaron was, should we give up on Tyson Barrie? My answer to him is in Colorado, there's there's like no competition on defense for Tyson Barrie's power play time, right? And he actually didn't do so badly considering how few goals Colorado scored, like how bad they were. Barrie had a really good stretch at the end. I think he ended still with around 40 points. So I feel like I wouldn't give up on him because I think that Colorado can they be like as bad as they were last year for all of next year? I know we haven't seen any changes yet, but I wouldn't give up on him. Like maybe give up on him. He was getting 50 plus points each year for the past few seasons, then like down to like closer to a 40-point guy last year. But I think that he's at least good for 40 points, which is good for a defenseman. And I still see the upside for 45, 50 points. Like, I wouldn't give up on him. I guess it depends when you say give up on him, like who are you going to get instead?
Yeah, exactly. I think the question is like, should you give up on Colorado as a whole, let alone Tyson Barrie? I mean, Eric Johnson is someone who can take points away from him. Nick Holden, when he was with Colorado, was sometimes getting some preferred treatment over Tyson Barrie too. Tyson Barrie, Patrick Waugh did not seem to really love him. He got demoted in terms of minutes and role. And then with Patrick Waugh gone, last year was just a gong show, not because Patrick Waugh was gone, but maybe because he quit at the end of the summer and they weren't ready for it. So yeah, like I'd still like to see 45-50 from Tyson Barrie. The question is, can Colorado support a defenseman getting that many points? And I have to say, I don't know that I have an answer for that. I'm curious to see what their offseason moves look like, and maybe that will give me some confidence in their front office, or it will just continue to keep it at a rock bottom level.
Yeah, and I mean, you could ask the same question about Landeskog and Duchesne, even Nathan MacKinnon, who is so great whenever he's not playing for Colorado, right? Whenever he's in one of these tournaments, like the tournament at the beginning of the year or the World Championships just recently, Nathan MacKinnon is like a top guy, like I think Carolyn Wilkie said in your interview with her. So, but then even Duchesne and Landeskog were guys that were always drafted. Next year, you'll probably be able to get them you'll probably be able to get them at a discount. And I put discount in quotes because who knows if it actually is a discount if this Colorado team continues to be so bad. So I feel like with these Colorado guys in general, maybe like you say, we have to wait and see what happens in the offseason before we dig too deep. Right now, like they're not looking great, but maybe they could do something to try to improve the team, or at least give us some confidence that all of these guys could improve back to the types of fantasy producers they were going into the season over the past few years. Brian, you see my list in front of me. Is there anyone else here you want to talk about to close out the show? I see you said you want to add Eberle.
Yeah, but are you just going to go through all of them?
No, we don't have to. Your call. Okay. I'm ready to wrap up. Oh, but we have a question actually here that I could ask because he was on the list. But why don't you like bring up Eberle now? If you.
Okay. Well, one name who I was expecting to be a bigger part of this episode, but maybe everyone's just already moved on, is Jordan Eberle, who had an awful season, was destroyed in the press, maybe to some degree rightfully so. I mean, destroyed by fans as well. It wasn't just the mainstream media not liking a season, but there is a number that describes how bad his season was, and it was a career low individual shooting percentage at even strength, way lower than it should have been. So like, even if some of what's being said about him is true about his low intensity or fitness or lack of motivation or just not clicking or not wanting to click, just not fitting in with this Oilers lineup, even if all of that is true, he still shouldn't have had as bad of a season as he did this year. So I like him for at least a small bounce back next year. I also noticed there was an ever so slight skewing of his shots to his on-wing side. So he's shooting on the right side. And that's a difference from the past couple of years when he's had success shooting from his off wing. Maybe that just accounts for a small piece of the puzzle here. I still contend that the individual shooting percentage accounts for the largest piece of the puzzle, but that could be another thing. So maybe they are using him in a way that isn't as amenable to him scoring goals as they were using him before.
Yeah, Eberle, man, that you'll be able to get him at a discount, assuming he's even in Edmonton, right? It's possible that they'll trade him for a defenseman in the offseason. I've seen a lot of people saying that they think they should do. I mean, keep in mind also, he had such a brutal playoffs, right? Only 2 assists and no goals. If you didn't like his regular season shooting percentage, how about a 0% shooting percentage in the playoffs in 13 games? So that was not very good. Though it is interesting when you look at his career stats all lined up as I'm doing right now. he had his most ever shots on goal in a season last year, believe it or not. He had 208 shots, which is his highest ever total, but only 20 goals, which is his lowest in the past 4 years. So I see where you're coming up with this idea that maybe it was a shooting percentage deal, but also we both recall how he was off the top power play and he was, not playing with great line mates for a lot of the year. I guess he was playing with Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, who's another guy who could totally be in this conversation. So it's tough to say. Like with Edmonton, I'd really like to see who he'd be playing with. It's nice to see that he could still take some shots. Maybe if some more went in, you could go from his 51 points to 55 points, but it's hard for me to expect him to go back to being like a 60-point guy. Like, don't forget, he only had 47 points the year before. It wasn't 69 games. So it's been a couple years now of him not being close to the 60, 65, like potentially 70-point guy that we thought that Edmonton had back when they first drafted him. Like, he had 76 points in his second season, and that seems so long ago at this point. I'll just go on. Another guy who was extremely disappointing last year, kind of in the Eberle camp, and maybe even worse, of someone who I thought it's just not even worth bringing him up because, of course, he's not going to be good, but maybe I'm wrong. Question from the chat from Barbecue Bruce asking if Louis Eriksson is bound for at least somewhat of a bounce back, or is he already done just 1 year into his 6-year contract? I would say that we already talked about him a little bit, right? Because he was a new coach, and we all recall how badly Radim Verbata did when he was on the team with the previous coach, and then he had a really nice bounce back last year in Arizona. So maybe the same could happen with Louis Eriksson?
Yes, I think so. When we talked about the coaching change in Vancouver, we said the biggest beneficiary could be Louis Eriksson, and by extension, the Sedins. I think he could be a really important piece of getting another quality year out of the Sedins. Mind you, if you stack your offense all on that line, yes, you have Bo Horvat elsewhere, and maybe Sven Berchi can chip in too, but maybe they'll try and spread it out more. But if they don't, or whatever, in any case, I think Louis Eriksson is going to be in better shape just by virtue of the coaching change. Last year, he had a really low shooting percentage, just less than 6.5%, when in the years prior, he had been at 12% 2 years ago and 11% the year before that. He also had a really low IPP. Like, he's used to being in the 80s and then more recently in the 70s. Last year, he was at 48% IPP, which we've said a lot, by the way. I don't know if we pointed out, Elon, that stands for individual point percentage. We already explained it earlier in the show, though.
Okay, so Brian, it's your last pick in your draft. You need a left wing. You're looking at the draft board. 2 former really valuable fantasy guys who I know you've liked are available. One is Louis Eriksson. Another is Andrew Ladd. Who do you go with?
Louis Eriksson. I was worried you were going to say Jordan Eberle, in which case I was going to really have a hard time answering that question. So I'm going to throw that one at you because I don't think that was a hard one. I would take Louis Eriksson. Who would you take between Louis Eriksson and Jordan Eberle?
I think I'd go Eberle.
Yeah, I think I'm leaning there too. But like you said, like I saw a headline the other day, Eberle is definitely, like in quotes, getting traded. I don't know who quoted it because I don't really dabble too much in the trade speculation articles. But, oh, wait, no, not a but. But maybe Eberle's location next year is going to be an important piece of deciding if he's worth more than Eriksson. It is, and I'm sorry to our Vancouver fan listeners, it's hard to be on a team where you have lower expectations for production than Vancouver. And I'm hoping Travis Green helps turn that around. But at the outset of the season, they're not one of the teams that you want to own a lot of fantasy players from.
Well, I know Cameron is going, well, I know patron and former podcast guest Cameron Robinson is very excited to own Brock Besser. So we'll see if he ends up being as valuable to him. But I'm sure he's going to trade him before the season starts once he talks him up to all of his fellow poolies, and he'll get back some like stud for him and end up rolling through his league like he always does. Okay, I guess you guys aren't too interested in Cameron Robinson's fantasy prospects, but it's a big part of the patron group. By the way, speaking of the patron group, as we're wrapping up the show, maybe you could consider becoming a patron of Keeping Karlsson, because if you like this content, we would love your support. And I think we give you something pretty fun in return, because you could join our patron-only Facebook group for only $1 a month. You could support the show over the summer, have access to all these conversations. We could have our own chat about which players you think were disappointing, whether you think they'll bounce back. Any question you ask, Brian and I are there to answer, as well as all the other patrons. We also do our monthly patron cast. You get access to all the old patron casts. We just did one last Wednesday, which was a lot of fun. Like I said, we went through a whole bunch of prospects and sophomores for next year that we thought could potentially have impacts in fantasy. So you could check that out. Plus, we have the Keeping Karlsson Ultimate Patron Fantrax League, which we are going to be starting to ramp up very soon. I'm very excited about that. We have some fun plans for that league, some changes for next year, which we'll get into on the podcast regular, but the patrons will get first dibs at finding out what's going on. So if you're interested in any of that, you can check out keepingkarlsson.com/patron. With that, unless, Brian, you have anything you want to say?
No, that's good.
Why don't we cue the outro music? And you could go ahead and read us the credits.
All right, this episode of the Keeping Karlsson Fantasy Hockey Podcast was presented by Dauber Hockey and supported by our patrons. It was researched with help from Dauber Hockey, Frozen Pool, Hockey Analysis, HockeyViz.com, Hockey Reference, Hockey Database, Elite Prospects, Flames Nation, Roto World, and Fantrax.
Thanks for everyone for listening. We hope you liked it. Let us know on Twitter at Keeping Karlsson what you thought of the start of our summer series, and we will catch you all with another episode in a couple weeks.
Until then, keep on keeping Karlsson. Karlsson.
Boom. I was a little rambly, I know, at some points, but I'm going to just say it's because I haven't done a regular episode for a while.
It's been a little while. I think if you want to try and
Thanks, Aaron.
See if our live producer solution is a workable one. I feel like these are the episodes on which we should be trying it.
What's a live producer solution? I don't know what you mean, actually.
To cut down your editing time. We were gonna see if anybody wanted to be a live producer and take notes of the times at which the stumbles or unhappy times happened.
Oh yeah. Well, if anyone's listening now, I guess I could ask on the Patreon group. I don't know if anyone would want to do this, but if anyone wants to have the job of being like the producer, would we even call it producer? I don't know. But yeah, if someone could just send me a list of at what times we had stumbles, and then when I edit, I could just jump to those times to edit them instead of having to listen through the whole show. That would save a lot of time, and we could try to think of some compensation. We'd be at your mercy. You would tell us what you want, and we try our best to accommodate. Yeah, if you're even listening at this point, let us know if that's something you're interested in. Maybe Brian and I could write up a post on the Facebook group. But yeah, aside from that, anyone in the well, I don't know why. I'm trying to prime for more questions. I'm good to go. I get to work.
Great
Gotta
job.
edit the show. So I guess next time we'll do the opposite, right? We'll do some players who had surprisingly good seasons and then see if we think they could do it again.
Yes.
I guess the trick there is it's so easy to just do all rookies and players who, we didn't expect much from and then they blew us away. But maybe we should, that's always more fun to try to find these guys who had never been good and they're 28, 29 years old and came out of nowhere, like a Nick Foligno.
Patrick Eves.
Oh, he was good. We don't know what team he'll be on, so it's very hard. Arvidsson. Oh yeah, he should lead off the show. Are you saying RV right now because you want us to talk about him on the next episode, or did you just score a goal? I don't have the scores on right now. 2-1 for the Predators. Man,
I'm guessing 3-1.
Who's Frederick?
Excited.
Who's Frederick Gaudreau, Brian? Is he someone we have to care about for next year? Or is it just because Johansson's injured?
No, he continues to get on the score sheet. So, I mean, it's also just this happens sometimes in the playoffs. We'll look into it. We could look into it.
Yeah, okay. I guess I could look up in the prospects guide. I could just search for him and see what they think about him.
Yeah, great idea.
Right now. I do it right now.
If you want to. I won't stop you.
Okay. Well, I don't know. Maybe you won't get off. Okay, we'll get off in a second. I'm just gonna look this up and then we'll be done. But you here, just talk for 1 minute.
Well, or you can just go and I'll be silent.
Oh, I could just go?
No, you can look and we just won't talk while it happens.
Oh, that's a good
Show's
point.
over, man.
Oh yeah, that's true. I don't know why. Okay, I've got the doc open. Now I'm gonna search for Gaudreau. Or Gaudreau. Is he another guy who I'm going to be calling Gaudreau and it's really Gaudreau?
I'm not sure what the pronunciation is on him.
Frederick Gaudreau. Okay, I've got him here. I haven't really dug into this to see how this. Dauber Hockey draft advice: do not draft. No relation to Johnny. They're saying his upside is David Desharnais. So that's not very good. Certainty of being an NHLer is 60%. That's not very good. Okay, I'm not too excited about him now. Well, according to this guide, he's having a nice playoffs. Aaron
Wow.
says the goal he scored was a beaut. All right. I'll just go back. I hope you guys don't like think I'm like trying to avoid like going back to hang out with my family. Like that's not, I just want to hang out for a little bit. Okay. See you, Brian.
See you,
so
Elon.
you'll do the write up?
As always.
As always. Okay, great. Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone. Thank you.